Continuing our series, Just Walk Across the Room by Billy Hybels. You heard the passage about being salty, bringing out the God flavors like a good chef always puts a little salt, even in candy, I learned, to make it sweeter. So are we to be salt. Here now is a story that comes from 2 Kings. I'm just going to read the first part of the story, but I'm going to invite you to take it home and read it all the way through. 2 Kings 5. Naaman, commander of the army of the great king of Aram, was a great man and in high favor with his master, because by him the Lord had given victory to Aram. The man, though a mighty warrior, suffered from leprosy. Now the Arameans, on one of their raids, had taken a young girl captive from the land of Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "If only my Lord were the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." So Naaman went in and told his Lord just what the girl from the land of Israel had said. And the king of Aram said, "Go then, and I will send along a letter to the king of Israel." So Naaman went, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of garments. This is God's word for God's people. Have y'all seen the commercials for the phones that you can strap onto a pair of goggles, and they're 3D, and you go from looking at a 2D screen to all of a sudden you're transported into a 3D experience? Have you seen those commercials? Have you watched the people who've put them on? They start watching this stuff and immediately they start waving their hands, or they're engaged in whatever it is that's going on inside those 3D glasses, aren't they? So I've not worn them myself, but I'd be very interested to see that. The 3D experience with those goggles makes a richer experience, doesn't it? Life is always richer in 3 dimensions than it is in 2. Hybels describes the richness of life that is possible when Christians engage with the people around them in 3D. Now, he has 3 different things that D stands for in 3D living. Develop relationships, discover life stories, discern how to resource the need. If you want to write those down, we're going to be talking about those. Develop relationships, discover life stories, and discern how to resource the need while in contact with the Lord, who has the bigger picture. So many of our Christian efforts skip those first 2, and we do ministry in 1D. We skip the relationships and the life stories, and we go right to sourcing the need. And many needs have been met materially because Christians, by and large, are generous people. But when we fail to live out the full 3D, we miss out on the richness of God's activity in that. What might it look like to live in 3D to the glory of God? Well, it's simpler than you think it might be. You don't need a special phone for it. Let's open up this story of Naaman and see what God might have us learn today and apply into our lives. Would you pray with me? Lord, living a 2-dimensional or a 1-dimensional life is very flat. Open our eyes, open our ears, open our hearts, that we may understand more clearly what it means to live in 3D to your glory. That the gospel might spread beyond these walls into a world who needs to hear of your love. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, Lord, for you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Naaman was a very important commander of the army of Aram, that's current-day Syria. So our story opens up with a surprising revelation that it was actually the God of Israel who's given victory to Syria. And right up front we see that this God of Israel is not an in-the-box God. This God of Israel is an out-of-the-box God. He's active in the life of people beyond Israel, even active in the lives of Israel's enemies. Naaman only had one issue in his life, but it was a biggie. Naaman had leprosy. Naaman the mighty was about to be taken down by a common and very contagious disease that he couldn't conquer on his own. So the scene set, enter a little girl whose name we don't even know. What we do know about this little girl is that she's a slave. She was taken away from her family who lives in Israel when she was a young age, and she is now serving as a slave to Naaman's wife. She has every right to be angry and bitter, does she not? She has every right to hope that the leprosy spreads in Naaman because she's been forced to live, even serve Israel's enemy. But instead, this young girl develops the first D of living a rich life in God. She develops relationships with her mistress. And she evidently had the trust of her mistress, because as we see later on in the story, her mistress will be the one to share the info that she gives to her with Naaman. While serving in this trusting relationship, the young girl is a part of the family life, as slaves commonly were, and she discovers the story of Naaman's leprosy, overheard in family conversation. And then, only after developing a relationship in trust and discovering Naaman's story, does this young girl enter the third D. She offers the only resource she has to help. That is her faith in the God of Israel. In that faith, she tells her mistress about God's prophet, Elisha, who as God's prophet has the power to heal Naaman. And Naaman's wife took the word of this trusted servant and relayed it to Naaman, who then approached the king of Syria. And the king of Syria sent Naaman to the king of Israel with riches to pay for whatever it cost for the cure and a letter of recommendation. But see, here's what he failed to understand. The God of Israel doesn't report to the king of Israel. It's supposed to be the other way around. And this particular king wasn't very good at that. Well, long story short, Elisha sent word to the king that the king should send Naaman to see Elisha, who didn't even bother to come out of his house to meet Naaman personally. He sent a messenger. He sent a messenger to meet this important man with a silly command. In order to clear up your leprosy, Naaman, you have to go wash in the Jordan River 7 times. Now, the Jordan River is kind of like the Mississippi River on a small scale. It's really muddy. And Naaman is thinking, I go wash in a muddy river? We have better rivers than this in Syria. This was offensive to Naaman, who was used to being treated with a lot of pomp and circumstance, and he nearly stormed off the scene were it not for some unnamed servants, again, powerless people in the life of Naaman, who convinced him to give it a try. What has he got to lose? And lo and behold, after washing 7 times in the muddy Jordan, Naaman's leprosy is gone. And Naaman comes to faith in God, this God of Israel. So let's stop and think about this story in light of 3D living, shall we? The foundation of this 3D living is trust, which can happen only in relationship. Trust between Naaman's wife and a young girl, trust between Naaman's wife and Naaman, trust between Naaman and his king, trust between Naaman and his unnamed servants. It's several trusting relationships that guided Naaman to healing and wholeness. I want you to also notice that distrust and a lack of relationship almost derailed the whole thing. Did you catch that? The king of Israel didn't trust the king of Syria. In fact, he accused coming together with this letter from this leper was a way to get a battle started. Naaman didn't trust Elisha or his messenger, didn't know him. Trusting relationships is the key for a foundation of 3D living. The second D, the little girl listened to the story of Naaman. She was attentive, and she cared about her master even though she had every right to be angry and bitter. But she discovered his story. And then she discerned how she could help in faith. And once she had discerned that she had the information of where to send Naaman, she took a risk and followed through. And here's the point. The only way God's independent activity on Naaman's behalf can come into any kind of clear focus is through the people of God. I must say that again, pay attention. The only way God's independent activity on anyone's behalf can come into clear focus is through the people of God. It's our job to be salty, to bring out the God flavors around us. And in this case, in this story, the salt was an unnamed little girl and an elusive prophet named Elisha. The story appears to be about Naaman. But when we live in 3D, we find the story is really about joining God in the finding and restoring of people into a relationship with God. The real hero is not the great warrior Naaman, who the world sees. The hero here is a small child in a powerless place in life. And because this small child lived a 3D life, a mighty warrior is humbled and healed and comes to faith in this God of Israel. He becomes a God follower. And if this little girl can figure out how to live in 3D all those many years ago without the technology, I think we might be able to do that too. Takes a little faith, takes a little risk, takes a willingness to follow. Develop relationships, engaging the world around us. Discovering stories, listening for places of connection and common good. Discerning next steps, following God's direction so that we may be a resource provider to the glory of God. And then I challenge you to follow through and take that risk. See how living in 3D changes lives